Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this video we're going to talk about a very successful woman. She was a successful podcaster, but she got some extremely unwanted attention from a very crazed fan. This went on for almost a year until it ended in the most tragic way possible. Before we get into it, if you would like to see new crime videos every week, please subscribe because this is all about that. Chapter. Now let's give it a go. In the early hours of Friday, the 10th of March 2023, a call came in to the Redmond Police Department, and that's Redmond just outside of Seattle, Washington. Now this call came from a fairly fancy, wealthy, upscale neighborhood. It's in the same area where the Microsoft headquarters, they're located there. And the house that we will get into, the house was worth $1.2 million. The 911 call that was made to the police, that came in at 1:45 a.m. A woman had ran from that house. She had booked it running to a neighbor's house to call the police there to let them know that an intruder, a stalker, had broken into the house. That woman told the police that she had heard shots and to get there, real quick. Now, the Redmond Police Department, it was only 3 minutes away from the house, so they got there pretty sharpish. When the police arrived, neighbors had begun gathering on the street, but the house itself, it was dark and it was eerily quiet. So with the reports of a shooter in the house, shots had been fired, officers, they gathered up outside the home, they drew their sidearms and they announced their presence to anybody who was inside that house. However, inside that house they would find bodies, as in more than one, and this would be the ending, the tragic and terrible ending to a story that had gone on for almost a year. This wasn't the first time the police had been called to this very address, if you can believe that. Someone had been watching it for months, looking through the windows, calling to the door, following the people who lived there as they traveled across America. And finally, this very night, they had gone inside. 33-year-old Zohre Sadeghi was originally from Iran, as was her husband, 35-year-old Malid Nazeri. They had been married since 2011, both working in Tehran in software. They were both software developers, rising up the ranks of the companies they worked in Iran until the married couple, they moved to the United States of America. Malid, he moved to the Seattle, Washington area in 2015, with his wife Zohre following him a year later as a graduate student. Malid worked for Google and most recently as lead software engineer for Amazon in Redmond, Washington. Zohre, a PhD student at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and then as a software engineer at a mortgage company. Both were self-styled techies who had moved across the world to be at the very heart of it in the Seattle area. And that house, it was a beautiful place and cost a pretty penny, but software engineers working for the companies that they were successful. So far so good for this young couple, and Zohre's mother, she would move in with them too into that very house, as we can just presume that she's probably getting on a little bit in years. Now this is when the trouble began. Now this part, it's a little bit vague with all of the news reports that have been released, but Zohre appeared on a podcast, or on a podcast that was streaming, and the podcast was about gaining employment in the tech industry, in the software industry, and it seems like the podcast was specifically for Persian people, from people from Iran and that sort of thing. Fair enough, right? I mean, she worked in the industry, her husband was getting pretty big in the industry, she would know everything somebody would need to do. Someone heard her speak about this on this podcast, and they liked what they heard, but not in a normal, healthy way at all. It appears now he may have heard this on the app Clubhouse. Now, Clubhouse is a fairly new app. It's only been up since around 2020. It's one you have to be invited to join, and essentially it's an audio-only thing. You join rooms, and people are talking about different topics and blah, blah, blah. And apparently this podcast, this discussion, was played on Clubhouse. So Zohre was speaking on Clubhouse about this very topic, and who just so happened to tune in 38-year-old Ramin Kodahharamrazai. Ramin was originally, much like Zohre and Malid, from Iran, and he was a trucker who lived in Texas, in the Houston area. He had been married for 7 years to a woman named Nida, and they had a daughter together. His story kind of almost mirrors Zohre and Milad's story. Him and his wife, they married in Iran before moving across to America. Now, they had actually divorced back in 2018, Ramin and his wife, well, ex-wife. But it still seems that they remained close. In fact, one thing we'll find about Ramin is that it seems like he didn't have very many friends at all. His wife would say they would talk all the time, and he would tell her about, romances he had, women he was seeing, and she would say he was telling her this, not as like some kind of evil ex trying to like twist the knife in, but more like he had nobody else to talk to. A lonely guy who, as a trucker, he would go on long, road trips, right? And while he was driving, perhaps he tuned in to the Clubhouse app, listening to people speaking in his native tongue, in Farsi, Persian. And then one time he heard 33-year-old Zohre. And Ramin and Zohre, they sparked up a friendship, yapping away about this and that, talking on Clubhouse. He followed up with her after she had spoken one day. Now, why he even tuned into that discussion? He was a 38-year-old trucker. What interest would he have in getting jobs in the tech industry? Who knows? Maybe he just liked hearing people speak his native tongue. But anyway, regardless, they started speaking away, and she is somebody who had a bit of a platform, a bit of an online presence. She was only more than happy to help out, chat. They spoke fairly often, apparently even meeting up one time. Even though she lived all the way in Seattle, he lived in Texas, but he would travel all the time. Way too many times, as you will see. But Ramin, it seemed like he was becoming a bit full on for Zohre. It seemed like he wanted a little bit more than just a friendship, and then that's when Zohre cut him off. He had fallen for her, and she wasn't, too keen on that at all. And she said, okay, let's stop this right here. Let's put it to bed. This can't end well. How right she was. He then began one of the most obsessive stalking campaigns of Zohre and her husband, Milad, you will ever hear. And so began the messages, the calls, the gifts, the knocking on the door. One time Zohre even had a business trip in Denver, from Seattle to Denver. He followed her. One particular time, he called her over 100 times in one day. Can you believe that? And I mean, obviously, what's your first thing? You're going to turn off your phone. You're going to bounce your phone off a wall. But she works in tech. She can't exactly just do that. So she would block all his numbers. He would still find a way to call her. She would block him on social media. He would still find a way to contact her. She would block all private numbers. He figured it out. How, in fact, he even got her phone number is a mystery. She never gave it to him. Every time they would contact when they were friends, they would talk online. In November 2022, that's when she told him, all right, stop. Stop talking to me. You stop trying to contact me. Verbally, she said it twice. 2 times. Stop. Obviously, he didn't listen. He would call nearby businesses, asking for her. He would manage to get in contact with her, saying that he was in her neighborhood and that he was coming over. He would then go to nearby businesses in her neighborhood, go into them, use their phones to call her. He would call, cry, begging her to meet with him. He would message her saying, delete your Instagram or make it public so I can see too. Another particular time, he was parked in her neighborhood. He was watching her house. He saw her husband. He waited till her husband, Milad, left. He was going to Australia, and as soon as he left the house and was out of the area, he called to the door with flowers. He is watching her all the time. He would send things like jewelry, a neck scarf, which, Zohre would immediately give to the police and report these incidents to the police, but nothing happened. In one report she made to the police, she wrote how he threatened to show up into her front yard and light himself and her tree, which they had in the front yard, on fire. He said he would do this to prove that he would love her forever. And he said that nothing short of his own death would stop him from obsessing over her. As you can imagine, this absolutely wreaked havoc on her psychology. One time in January, she had to have a back surgery, and she was scared shitless because she knew that if she had surgery, she wouldn't be able to run if something happened. She developed anxiety, insomnia. Her and her husband, Milad, became so fearful that he would one day break in and do God knows what to them. That knocking on the door and calling them just wouldn't cut the mustard anymore. Unfortunately, we found out. On the 2nd of March 2023, a bench warrant was issued for Ramin Kodakaramreza's arrest. He was charged with 1 count of misdemeanor stalking and 2 counts of telephone harassment. The very next day, a judge granted a temporary order of protection, with a hearing set for a non-temporary order of protection. So this was at the start of March. Zohre was requesting that this temporary order would last 99 years. She knew, he would never stop. He had serious issues, but this wasn't her goddamn problem to deal with. That's his problem. Although whatever, mad shit was going on in his head, he was dangerous at this point. Yeah. And for her, what it started off as just, trying to help out other people, help out people maybe who were in her situation, give them a leg up. It turned into getting the attention of this guy who turned out to be a full-blown psychopath. Now, one thing about Ramin is he never had any prior arrests or anything, no history at all. But something in him. So even though this order of protection was granted, there was one problem. The police in Redmond, they couldn't find him. They couldn't make contact with Ramin. Well, for one, he lived out of state. He lived in Texas. And 2, as a truck driver, you never know where he is. Then, late on the 9th of March, he crept up this very quiet, leafy, residential street in his red truck. The road, it was on a hill. He glided his red truck up. Nobody spotted him. Nobody saw him. This was a Thursday night. Nobody would have been around to witness anything. How long he waited, how long he was watching that house, no one knows, but he had just been there the day before. What was going through his messed up mind, nobody knows, but at about 1:30 a.m., he got out of his truck and he started walking towards a house he knew, the surroundings very, very well. He'd been stalking it for months, and the day before, as I said, he had pretty much done a trial run of what he was about to do. And he found that one of the bedroom windows would give him access into the house. It appears he got in, and there he encountered Zohre's mother. They had some kind of altercation, and she managed, though, to flee the house. She managed to book it. She ran out of the house. She ran to a neighbor's house, slamming on the door, and in there she managed to call the police. But she would say that as she was running, she had heard shots ring out right behind her.
They have the active hostage situation. The shooter is not detained.
Redmond officers arrived real soon and drew their weapons with reports of an active shooter who also happened to be an insane person. And it didn't take long for them to find the first person. As they drew out their sidearms, walked towards the house, called out Redmond Police Department, just at the front door, they found Millard. Now, he was still alive at the time, but he would pass away within minutes. He had been shot once in the chest. He'd been shot and he'd managed to try and run out of the house to escape, but he collapsed just at the door. Police then went through the house, slowly calling out, checking every room, until they eventually got to the master bedroom. And there is where they found Zohre. She'd been shot. She'd been shot dead. And on the ground beside her lay this psycho. He, after shooting Millard and shooting Zohre, while she was in bed, he turned the gun on himself. He said this would only end with his death. It shouldn't have had to end with hers too. And it probably went out exactly as he hoped, that they would go together. Which kind of makes this just all the more sickening. She'd done everything right. She'd contacted the police multiple times. In January, in December, filing the order in March. They both did everything right. And still, there was a guy who just couldn't take no for an answer. A guy who had lost his mind and had then done one of the most horrific and disturbing acts of finally being so obsessed with somebody he couldn't stop, and eventually broke in and murdered them.
This is the absolute worst outcome, for a stalking case. A restraining order is simply a piece of paper that allows officers to take enforcement action should a suspect violate the court order, but a piece of paper does not protect a person when someone is intent on causing them harm.
It's a real tragic story of, as I said, people who did everything right, and still, Zohre just happened to have a presence one day, a platform to speak and try and help people, and one person just latched onto it like a goddamn tick And eventually was just sucking the life out of her until he had to end her life and end his own because he killed her because he was so obsessed with her, but it seems like he also couldn't live without her. Just a real sad, sick piece of shit. 1.5 million of you, by the way. That's the amount of people who have downloaded and listened to the That Chapter podcast, which has blown me away. Thank you so much for everybody who's tuned in to the podcast. That really means so much to me. I was kind of nervous, when launching it, as it was something different, but the reaction has just been absolutely overwhelming. I don't think I'll be able to ever thank you enough. I want to do something different, tell different types of stories, and yeah, seems like some of you like it, so that is great. If you ever are keen to check out for some more That Chapter longer stories, check out the podcast that comes out twice a week with a brand new podcast only episode every Monday. And then on Fridays, I put out a second episode, which is usually a mix of older episodes that I've really been keen to revisit, but also sprinkling in some new cases too. It's a lot of fun telling new types of stories, which is something I actually kind of want to do here as well. Mix things up, a little bit in the future. By the way, don't worry, it's still going to be Mike telling crime stories. But just, it's important to have a little bit of fun every once in a while. Well, fun talking about crime, probably not a great way to put it. But never fear, I ain't going anywhere, and the next video will be in a couple of days. So look forward to that. Maybe there'll be a little bit more Mike in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and please take care of yourselves, because I love you for being here. Mike out.